Dr. Sheveland. This is my presentation on faith, certainty, and John Henry Newman, dialogue around the Catholic Church's understanding of faith and certainty in the 19th century. So rather than immediately getting into the text, I wanted to come back to the core question of what does it mean to be human, particularly looking at it through the lens of faith and certainty, which begs the question of the epistemology of knowledge, how we acquire knowledge, and essentially, how do we know what we know? John Henry Newman brings up a similar question of can faith be held with genuine certainty, which he addresses in his publication, Essay in Aid of a Grammar of Assent. This publication addresses the 19th century dissension between the Catholic Church and scientific progress. This reflected a shift in societal perspective away from faith-based belief and onto rational thought. This was driven by a division between religion and science, particularly through John William Draper's conflict thesis, which asserted that scientific power of free inquiry was opposed with, which, pardon me, opposed scientific power of free inquiry versus religious institutional authority. He presented opposition between science and religion and stated an inherent incompatibility with the understanding of the world. Provide some context on this dialogue. Darwin produced his On the Origin of Species, or Darwin published his On the Origin of Species in 1859. The following year, the Oxford evolution debate of Huxley versus Wilberforce, and it presented a societal shift towards acceptance of evolution. In 1864, Pope Pius IX published the Syllabus of Errors, which explicitly condemned liberalism, freedom of the press, separation of church and state, supporting the idea of religious institutional authority. And the First Vatican Council, published in 1870, defines papal infallibility, both supporting religious authority. John William Draper then publishes History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science in 1874. His framework goes as follows. Institutional religion, particularly Catholicism, has historically suppressed free inquiry in order to protect authority. However, science represents the liberation of the human mind from religious suppression, particularly through the idea of ratiocination, which is exact logical reasoning, formal inference, and is the only path to genuine certainty. John Henry Newman, first of all, one of the most prominent 19th century Catholic apologetic theologians and a cardinal, presents his argument against. He had an interesting experience with faith, experiencing many conversions, was highly influential on a significant number of the most prominent Catholic theologians of the following century, such as Bouyer, Balthasar, Ratzinger, Lubac. He had significant influence on the Vatican II Council, with particular emphasis on their integration of conscience, importance of dogma, sensus fidei fideum, development of doctrine, and in particular, relation to discourse, bringing Catholic tradition in dialogue with the modern world, which is essentially the basis of synodality. Now, moving on to the book that I read, An Essay in Aid of a Grammar of Assent. Grammar of Assent was published in 1870. This addresses the central question, as presented earlier, of can faith be held with genuine certainty? Now, the reason for this illustration is to help understand the logical flow of the argument, as it's very complex. I had a paper for this that I had printed out and would have passed around class, and putting it up on a whiteboard behind me only inverts it. This was my best solution. I apologize. So John Henry Newman introduces a bunch of new terminology, which I will break down, as well as the logic following. How he asserts a genuine certainty on faith. So he begins with a proposition, which is essentially just a refutable claim. That refutable claim has no stance until it is apprehended, well, where it still has no stance. But the act of apprehension is the mental act of holding an idea or object. Now, the division between notional apprehension and real apprehension is within the distinction of how the proposition is apprehended. When the when the mental act of holding an idea is abstract, it falls within the notional apprehension. Um, for example, the statement of all humans are mortal, you understand it notionally as a logical proposition. It is a concept. Um, However, within the realm of real apprehension, which is the mental act of holding an idea concretely, vividly, and connected to particular images, experiences, and personal reality. Um, this takes hold of the objects from within, whereas notional apprehension takes hold of the objects from external, from outside. Now, using the same example of the statement of all humans are mortal, but if that statement is exerted in the moment where you're sitting next to a dying person or a dying loved one or experiencing death, um, your apprehension is shifted. Um, there's a shift in your apprehension in how the proposition is grasped, whether it's abstractly or concretely. Being concretely now, as it is tied to a experience, or as it is tied to the experience of understanding uh, mortality. Moving forward through apprehension to assent. Assent is characterized by four absolute properties, which is one that is singular and indivisible. It is unconditional and absolute, and therefore it is binary. It is a affirmation or rejection of the proposition. It is a either or. So understanding notional assent is retaining within the realm of abstract. It is agreeing to the proposition that has been apprehended abstractly, understanding it operate and therefore it operates at the level of ideas and their logical relations. It is inert in life. However, agreeing to the proposition that has been apprehended vividly and concretely, um, as within real assent, um, it grips and moves the person. So, an example of this is a theology student might assent notionally to God as love as a correct doctrinal statement, fully believing it to be true while it remains somewhat inert in their daily life. However, upon a profound experience of grace or suffering, the same student might assent to the same statement of God as love in a way that reorganizes how they actually live, meaning that assent is operative, not just intellectual. An important point of confusion is um, notional assent versus inference, as both of them work with notional apprehension. The distinction is within the conclusion. Um, Inference concludes conditionally. Within inference, the conclusion conditionally follows the premises. However, within notional assent, the conclusion is affirmed unconditionally. Therefore, the inference is graded and exists on a spectrum, while notional assent is binary and indivisible. Again, the characteristics of assent. When dealing with relations, when dealing with inference, you're dealing with relations between ideas. However, when you're dealing with notional assent, you're dealing with realities. Now, moving forward uh, through John Henry Newman's interpretation of conscience. And so, conscience is his response to the question of how do you get from human experience to knowledge of God without simply asserting it or relying on abstract philosophical proof. So he understands conscience as the feeling, and it is twofold. It has a moral sense and it has a dictate sense. The moral sense is the judgment of reason. It is impersonal, it is evaluative, it contemplates objects, not persons, and it is directed outward at the actions and their qualities. An example of the objectivity would be a parallel to another sense of taste. which only appeals to its own sense of whether or not something is good or enjoyable. Something tastes good purely because of the quality of food. An example of the detachment from emotion is considering the circumstance of driving and running a red light. You might experience fear of consequence, but you don't experience guilt or shame, or not a sense of responsibility. You may have the notion of I probably should have stopped, um, and the wrongness presents itself directly, but the sense of wrong is directed at the action. On the inverse, there is no sense of peace or self-approval for stopping. It is not tied to emotion. Um, on the contrary, uh, the dictate conscience or the sense of duty, referred to by John Henry Newman as just conscience, which is confusing, is the feeling of responsibility. It is emotional and therefore relational, because particular emotions, shame and guilt, are relational emotions and require a personal other. It is directed inward as a moral agent. This example um, is independent of social consequence. And so imagine you are sitting on a bench next to a random person alone, aside from the two of you in a park. They stand up, ask you to watch their bag, and leave. You notice that their wallet is still within their bag. There is no there is no social consequence if you take the wallet. You also have no relation to them. Morally, you know the act of stealing is wrong. However, there is a second distinct faculty that arbitrates this guilt and shame about taking the wallet and leaving. Rationally, you can argue that taking the wallet is opportunistic or financially smart, or their naive mindset justifies justifies this as their own fault, or this is just the way the world works. But the feeling of guilt is only covered, and it is different than the feeling if you had never taken their wallet. Um, this is the experience of dictate conscience. So, in how that applies in Newman's application of conscience on God, if this experience of conscience occurs out of context with other persons, but it involves the sense of being seen, addressed, and held accountable by person. Um, and if the experience of moral obligation occurs within a social vacuum, and the induced relational emotion, shame or guilt, is tied to relation, it is required a personal um, is required a personal other, and this is a universal experience. It can be inferred that there's an implicit presence behind the dictate conscience. However, a specific or a very important understanding of the logic it is not a formal logical step of conscience exists, therefore God exists. Rather, it is the experience of conscience as God being implicitly present within, um, becomes a experience of real apprehension, where God is therefore encountered and the conclusion is not inferred. So uh, moving forward from conscience, we come to inference, which was mentioned prior. So the distinction between formal and informal inference, formal inference is ratiocination, exact logical reasoning uh, used to deduce conclusion from premises. Conclusions are held conditionally upon each premises. Examples of this are complex math or geometry. Now, informal inference differs as it is the accumulation or the process of accumulation of probabilities independent of each other, individually inconclusive, converging onto a single conclusion from multiple directions simultaneously. That seems confusing to understand, but a clarifying example is knowledge that the Earth is round. You have never personally been to space or gone around the world, but the maps, testimony of astronauts, consistency of historical accounts and government records and NASA between countries and whatnot produces together conviction. Now, breaking these down into the characteristics. So, formal inference is sequential. Each premise is conditional upon the prior premise. Explicit, every premise can be explained under logical rule. And the conclusion vectors towards the direction of truth in relation to other premises, therefore producing conditional certainty. This only formal inference really only exists within formal math and pure logic. However, informal inference is cumulative and convergent, is not explicit, meaning it cannot always completely articulate every consideration, and it achieves moral certainty, which is certainty sufficient for action and commitment. It produces reasonable certitude, which depends on informal and personal inferences. This is the reasoning used every day. Moving forth, we get to one of Newman's most uh, famous within this publication is the elative sense. Um, the elative sense is the internal judgment, the trained personal rational faculty that performs and regulates informal inference. Now, he presents three aspects that uphold the legitimacy of the elative sense as the final judgment of validity. Now, the first being sanction. This responds to the question of what gives the elative sense its authority. Um, he comes to the conclusion that it is indispensable, and he finds this through questioning, through the question of is my own judgment of reasoning authentic, which inherently requires the use of one's own judgment of reasoning. Um, Moving forth onto his second aspect is the aspect of nature, which responds to the question of what is the nature or kind of thing of the elative sense. He concludes this with phronesis, which is the Greek Aristotelian word for practical wisdom or prudence, which is the ability to discern the right course of act in specific complex situations. Now, four claims that the elative sense is made by nature. One, universal in operation, but variable in the degree of need, dependent on how much formal logic is supplemented by the elative sense. Two, the domain specific in its development, meaning experience. Elative sense is experience in one field does not translate or transpose onto other fields. For example, a doctor may not be uh, proficient, may not have strong elative sense with philosophy, um, may not have strong, sorry, judgment on his informal inference, the meaning of elative sense with philosophy or theology, however, very good with matters pertaining to medical. The third is it is consistent methodologically across domains through the process of informal inference, which characterizes um, the elative sense. And fourth, the elative sense is the ultimate standard, and the job is to develop it. There is no external criterion to appeal to verify the elative sense. It requires use. And so the third, and so that concludes the four claims of the elative sense. Now, his third aspect that he found is range, and it responds to the question of what can the elative sense be applied to, which he concluded with wherever informal inferences are made. Um, with that understanding of the elative sense and its validity, um, he moves on to process of achieving certitude. Certitude is defined as the reflective, irreversible state of mind with rational grounds and sentiment of sui generis, Latin for of its own kind. Now, prior to unconditional certitude, one has to understand the two other distinctions of assent, simple and complex. Simple, very straightforward, is the unreflective immediate agreement, which has no conscious reflection. And so, for example, that is believing the sun will rise, again, believing in your own name, and this has no defense against challenge. Complex assent uh, is self-reflected and ratified through, and itself and self-ratified, really. It is defensible, and uh, and certitude is a form of complex assent. However, it has three conditions. Furthermore, upon for certitude, for certitude. The first being reflective ratification and rational grounds. Um, Truth, it is the perception of a truth with the perception that it is truth. Um, so it is investigation and proof. So without this aspect of reflection, certitude becomes interpretive certitude or simple assent. Without the rational grounds, it becomes a rash judgment or prejudice. The second condition is that certitude is indefectible, meaning that confidence in a certitude will last. But if your confidence, if being confident in a certitude will last, but if your confidence wavers or fails, the thing itself, whatever it is, will remain as true and irreversible. So it is irreversible permanence. So without this permanence, certitude becomes a conviction. Now, the third one, which is the most difficult to understand, is sui generis sentiment, again, of its own kind. This is the most difficult to understand because it's not tied to a specific um, sentiment. It is a unique phenomenological texture. It generally occurs as a sense of self-repose, serene satisfaction, peace in the absence of doubt, but it depends on the context of certitude. Now, this is the best analogy. So a conscious deed is attended by a self-approval which nothing but itself can create. So certitude uh, it produces its own sentiment of sui generis in which it is unique to certitude. So without this sense of finality, certitude is scarcely more than inference. Moving forward, conclude of how this unconditional certitude relates to certainty of faith. And tied to his conclusion is Pope John Paul II's Fides et Retia, or Faith and Reason. And so, beginning with this quote, is faith and reason are like two wings of which the human spirit rises to contemplation of truth, which reiterates or which explains an aspect of my thesis. So Draper states that ratiocination, exact logical reasoning, is the only path to genuine certainty. However, religion and reason are not competing epistemologies, rather, but shared. Two distinct yet complementary orientations towards truth and rational reasoning operated through conscience and the elative sense prepares the capacity for faith, which is an unconditional certitude. Faith is the complete engagement of all cognitive moral faculties. This will be explained through these 3 points. So the first being two distinct orders of knowing the same reality. John Henry Newman uh, illustrates this through knowledge of God and his will. Knowledge of God is understood two, um, through his two understandings of religion. Natural religion, which is obtained by the self, the mind, or the mind, which is the conscience, the voice of mankind, which is cross-cultural religious practice, and course of the world, which is the established order of things. Um, the second being revealed, which is predicated upon belief in natural religion. Now, belief in natural religion um, is done through it is an unconditional certitude done through reason. It operates through conscience in the elative sense, delivering natural religion. Revelation completes what reason begins but cannot finish alone. They're distinct in source and object, but aimed at the same reality. Natural religion produces moral experience and real apprehension of God as a moral presence, conscience. However, it cannot account for revealed truths such as the Trinity, incarnation, um, church, or Christ. Um, Fides et Ratio states that there exists a twofold order of knowledge, distinct not only with regards to their source, but also with regards to their objects. With regards to the source, because we all know in one by natural reason, and other by the divine faith, reiterating John Henry Newman's um, statement above. The second point is the elative sense bridges the epimis, epistemic epistemology of oh my god of concrete knowledge. So John Henry Newman first states skeptic assumption that formal explicit inference is the only well the understanding is skeptic assumption is that formal explicit inference is the only valid way to certitude. Therefore, faith is not certain and irrational. Formal inference delivers conditional certainty within notional abstract reality. It is um, a concrete reality. Unconditional certitude and faith is insufficient on formal inference alone. However, religious and scientific knowledge are therefore epistemologically identical in structure. Both reach certitude through informal inference regulated by the illative sense. They are equal in ep, epi epistemolo epistemology, really. Um, uh, finds it ratio states faith is complete engagement of all human cognitive and moral faculties. Um, and which leads me to my third point, the preparation of the mind, conscience as the precondition. So this is one of the most important points. So belief in revealed is predicated upon belief in natural, yet natural religion is incomplete without revealed, as they are the same truth. So natural religion is the formed interior disposition of the inquirer. Um, natural religion forms the interior disposition of the inquirer, which is a precondition. This formed state of mind is a precondition that makes one capable of real assent of revealed religion, certitude of faith. This interior orientation towards a personal God, which is taken seriously through conscience. Key. Reason operating through conscience and the illative sense prepares the very capacity through which faith becomes possible, which is reiterated by the feeds et ratio, which is reason is a one-sided concern to investigate human subjectivity. Seems to have forgotten that men and women are always called to direct their steps towards a truth which transcends them. Sundered from that truth, individuals are at the mercy of caprice. Meaning, untethered reason creates drift, and it needs conscious to function. I appreciate your time. Thank you.